Hi, folks. Thanks for tuning in today. My name is Chanel Hason, and we are going to talk about the Elakha Alliance. So, getting to know us, what we're doing here in Oregon, working to bring sea otters back to the Oregon coast, a little bit about kelp and estuaries, and the history of sea otters here on the Oregon coast. And I mentioned in the chat if you want to type in where you're tuning in from tonight, so we can get a little more acquainted, that would be delightful. So, a little bit background of who is here talking to you today. So, I'm the Director of Outreach and Community Relations for the Elakha Alliance. My background is in marine biology. I fell in love with the ocean when I was 5 years old with that cute little orca person at SeaWorld. And decided I wanted to be a marine biologist and a marine mammal trainer. So I went to Cal State University, Monterey Bay for my undergrad in environmental science technology and policy, focusing on marine and coastal ecology. I got to work with the sea otters and the river otters at the Monterey Bay Aquarium. I studied abroad in Australia doing research on the Great Barrier Reef. I graduated, definitely didn't find a job in marine biology in LA and had lots of odd jobs. But after a couple of years, I ended up being Miss Scuba USA. So there's an international scuba diving beauty pageant. Who knew? So I flew out to Malaysia and competed with like 15 other countries as the only marine biologist and rescue scuba diver. I thought that was pretty fun. I won 3 titles, so I was proud of that. But after that, I moved to Puerto Rico, worked as an eco tour guide naturalist for Jean-Michel Cousteau's Ambassadors of the Environment program, and realized my passion really lies in education, environmental education, marine science education. So I moved to Portland 10 years ago and got my master's in education at Portland State. And then I found this job with the Elakha Alliance in the middle of Portland. There was a sea otter conservation job, lo and behold, and I applied, and here we are, 5 years later. I was the first ever employee. So that's just a little bit about me, so you know who's talking to you this evening. For our presentation today, we're going to jump around a little bit. So we'll talk about sea otter biology, estuary and kelp forest ecology, and the past, present, and future of sea otters here in Oregon. And I forgot to mention, but if you have any questions throughout the presentation, please use the chat feature. Actually, is it? Oh yeah, it's there. And or you can type it into just the webinar chat too, whatever makes you happy. And then we'll get to it at the end of the presentation. So, sea otters themselves are part of the Mustelidae family, which are related to wolverines, badgers, minks, weasels. And so there's 3 subspecies of otters, sea otters. We have the northern subspecies, which is the largest population. So they are located in Washington, British Columbia, and Alaska. And then we've got the southern sea otter that are all off of the coast of California. Then we have the Asian or Russian sea otter, which are off the coast of Japan and Russia. There's really no big differences between the 3 subspecies, just that they're geographically separate from each other. They are the only otter species out of 14 across the globe that are fully aquatic. So every other otter species is semi-aquatic, which means they don't live in the ocean or in a river. They den on land. So that's what separates sea otters from that group. They live about 10 to 20 years. In captivity, they can live slightly longer, and usually females live a little longer than males do. And they do everything in the ocean. They eat, they sleep, and they give birth, they swim, they do everything out in the water. They can be social animals. They aggregate in floating rafts, usually by sex. And they're not a migratory species. So they have really strong site fidelity wherever they were born. So, compared to every other marine mammal who has a really thick layer of fat called blubber to keep them warm in cold ocean waters, sea otters don't have that. Instead, they have the densest fur of any animal on the entire planet. It's actually 2 layers of fur, and so they're constantly grooming themselves because they're trapping a layer of air between those 2 layers of fur, and that's what keeps them insulated. So their bottom layer of fur never actually gets wet. So I usually ask this if I'm in front of a group of people, but maybe you can use the chat. How many hairs per square inch, which is about the same size as the O, if you do the OK symbol, do you think there is on a sea otter's pelt? In 1 square inch, how many hairs do you think there is? Does anybody want to take a guess? We've got 1,000,000, 150, 50,000. Great guesses. Yes, it sounds like some people may know this answer. So it's usually about 600,000 to 1 million hairs per square inch, which is a lot. Compared to our human head, we have about 100,000 hairs just on our head, if we're lucky. So they utilize this really thick, dense fur to keep them warm in the chilly waters that they like to live in. Oops, I forgot to do my special. Ta-da! 1 million hairs. There you go. Good job for everyone who got it right. So sea otters are eating machines. They are constantly consuming food because they have a really high metabolic rate, which also makes their temperature about 100 degrees. And so they have to constantly eat to stay warm. And so their diet consists of over 100 different species of invertebrates, which include sea urchins, clams, crabs, mussels, sometimes squid. Not often do they eat fish, so that's a common misconception. There are some in Alaska that have kind of found a way to eat fish, but really the majority of the species overall takes the time to dive down and grab something pretty stationary to eat. They don't want to expend a lot of energy swimming after fish. But they're highly intelligent creatures. So they use tools like rocks to crack open hard-shelled invertebrates that they like to eat. So they kind of use the rock as an anvil and put the clam on their chest and crack it that way. Sometimes they even use stationary rocks and just smack it up against there, which we have an example of that coming up in a little video. Surprise, coming soon. So something I really love about sea otters is even though they look really cute, they have a super strong bite force. So you never ever want to put your fingers near a sea otter regardless, because they have the same bite force as a black bear, which is about 80 pounds. And they also have fracture resistant teeth. So their enamel is twice as strong as our human teeth, which is super helpful when they're eating all those hard-shelled invertebrates, right? And so they are the definition of you are what you eat. And why do I say that? Is because they eat so many purple sea urchins that it turns their skull, their teeth, their bones, even their vertebrae purple. And it's a phenomenon known as echinochrome staining. So it happens when they just eat copious amounts of these purple sea urchins. So it's sort of similar to when humans eat carrots and their skin can turn a little orange. But for sea otters, it's happening internally. Pretty wild. And I actually have, if you see me tabling anywhere, I do have a real sea otter skull that washed ashore in Newport that has some purple teeth. So be sure to find me sometime. So unfortunately, there are some threats to sea otters. So, firstly, let's talk about white sharks. So, sea otters aren't on the menu for white sharks. They're looking for fatty seals and sea lions. But when juvenile white sharks transition from juvenile to adults, they're changing from eating fish to marine mammals. And sea otters look a heck of a lot like those seals and sea lions that they're looking for from underneath the water. So they often take investigative bites of sea otters, which is often very fatal for the sea otter. And then we have orcas. So there's a special pod in Alaska that is really well trained hunters specifically for sea otters. There was one female orca that washed ashore deceased. She had 6 sea otters in her stomach, and then one was stuck in her throat, the 7th one. And then we have some human-caused disturbances like oil spills, which when you think about a sea otter has to keep their pelt really nice and clean, and that's how they keep warm. So if they get oil on it and then they're trying to groom it, they ingest the oil, and then it's super detrimental and deadly for sea otters. And we've got climate change disruptions, plastic pollution, ocean acidification, and even diseases from pollution, which include, surprisingly, cat poop. So feral cats that poop, on the ground. And then when it rains, it flows into the ocean, and there's a bacteria called Toxoplasmosis gondii in cat feces. And so that gets into the water, and that causes a lot of neurological problems for sea otters. So, I get this question all the time. How do you tell the difference between sea otters and river otters? We have a lot of river otters here in Oregon, North American river otters. So I get a lot of emails throughout the years saying, "Oh, I just saw a sea otter running along the beach or swimming in the river." And so if you ever think you see an otter of any kind or a sea otter specifically, send me a photo or video and I can determine what you actually saw. So let's dive a little deeper into the differences. So North American river otters, they're kind of like really long torpedo bodied. So their tail is about half the size of their whole body. So that's one of the key differences between sea otters and river otters. Look at the tail. If it's super long, that's a river otter. River otters also have the same size webbed forepaws, and so they are super agile runners, climbing on rocks. They den on land, so they dig around a lot. So if they're really agile running on land of any kind, that's most definitely a river otter. They have short legs, and they're slightly smaller than sea otters. They're about 15 to 30 pounds. They're usually in groups of 3 to 4 little family units. They have multiple pups, that's why. And sometimes they do go into the ocean, especially near river mouths to forage for food. The only time I've seen a river otter has actually been on the south coast of Oregon, off the coast of Port Orford. They were on a rock way offshore a little bit while we were diving out there. So they can swim in the ocean, which I can understand why people would get confused. They don't live out in the ocean. Compared to sea otters, sea otters are larger. They're about 50 to 100 pounds. And that may seem deceiving because you only see them floating above the surface, or it's kind of like an iceberg. They have a big body underneath. They're super buoyant. And in that picture with the one standing on its back flippers, you can see those back flippers are big. They are designed to swim and stay in the water, and then their tail is pretty much the same length as their flippers. So it's a small tail they really use kind of as a rudder while they're swimming. Um, and they only have one pup of a year. They rarely come onto land. So sometimes you'll see them hauled out on rocks. They're sunbathing or grooming, or most oftentimes they're just sick. But they are designed and really love to stay in the water. So if you see something running on the beach, that's going to be a river otter. Okay, now that you are all experts on the differences, let's watch a video. So here we have some footage from the Oregon Zoo. Which ones are these? What kind of otters? You can put it in the chat. Oh, now I switched. I'll help you. These ones are different than the first ones. These are river otters. So they've got these long tails. They really love hard-boiled eggs. And we're back to the sea otters. So you'll see here how they use tools. Look at those fracture-resistant teeth working. And here we go, using the rock to crack open their yummy food. They're also very rambunctious animals, and they have a lot of energy. But there's a reason why these animals are some of the top Instagram likes for every zoo and aquarium. Okay, now let's chat a little bit about sea otters and their role in healthy estuaries. So an estuary is a place where freshwater and saltwater meet. So usually when a river mouth and the ocean combine. And so since we don't have sea otters on the Oregon coast, let's jump to one where there are sea otters. And that would be the Elkhorn Slough off of the coast of California. It's California's most significant and largest estuary near Monterey Bay. which is the home to a lot of sea otters off of the California coastline. So this slough is home to over 340 species of birds, sea otters, fish. It's a really great place to do ecotourism. You can rent a kayak and go out and see, excuse me, so many animals. Woo, hold on. Sorry, I don't want to cough on. I apologize. It's always fun when you get a coughing fit in the middle of a presentation. Woo. Okay, I'm so sorry. All right. Okay. So, one researcher in particular, Dr. Brent Hughes, out of Sonoma State University. Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. Now my eyes are watering. Thanks. Oh, I got a secret water transfer. Okay, so that's much better. Dr. Brent Hughes out of Sonoma State has been the front runner in figuring out how the interconnectedness of sea otters and estuary health has improved since sea otters have been there. And so he discovered that with sea otters present in the slough, they are controlling the crab population. And if the crab population was not in control, these crabs would be eating these little tiny sea slugs, and these sea slugs eat algae that grows on eelgrass blades. And so if there's eelgrass covered in algae, those blades can't find the sun and they can't photosynthesize and thrive. So with sea otters present, they're eating the crabs, which allows the sea slugs to be plentiful and do their job of eating the algae growing on the blades. And thus, the eelgrass can photosynthesize and thrive. And that is super positive for the overall health of the ecosystem. And so Dr. Brent Hughes and his team have also discovered that sea otters help with erosion in the slough. So in 2024, sea otters made their modeling debut on the cover of Nature magazine with this new research. And so he found that with sea otters controlling the marsh crab population, which dig down and burrow and disrupt the roots of the eelgrass, that with those crabs being eaten by the otters, it has decreased erosion up to 90% in the slough, which is really great because if you have clearer water in the slough, then that helps with the overall health of the ecosystem and allows the eelgrass to have the sun and photosynthesize and thrive. You see a common theme here. And so there's another really amazing research study that Dr. Brent Hughes did with his team on invasive European green crabs, which are an invasive species down in California, which we also have here on the Oregon coast. And so he discovered that one southern sea otter in the Elkhorn Slough can eat between 50,000 and 120,000 European green crabs annually, which is really huge because these invasive species eat other native species. They eat larval Dungeness crab. They take over location of other animals in the slough. So to have a check on this invasive species population is really critical to the health of the ecosystem. And so if sea otters were reintroduced into Oregon, perhaps they could help also with our invasive European green crab population too. So overall, when you have sea otters in estuaries, everybody is winning. You've got improved water quality, the decreased erosion and clearer water. Eelgrass stores carbon. They're a big carbon sink. It's a safe haven for migratory birds. It's a great place for nurseries, for harbor seal pups, for sea otter pups, for juvenile crab and fish, and it increases the biological productivity overall of the whole ecosystem. So now let's dive into another ecosystem that sea otters thrive in, and that is kelp forest. So, giant kelp forests, like the one seen here, comprise 25% of the world's coastline from California to Australia, South Africa, and Central America. They are one of the ocean's most diverse ecosystems. So, over 100 or over 1,000 different species depend on this healthy kelp forest for home, for nurseries, for safe havens. Um, and this specific kelp forest is down off of the coast of Monterey Bay. This is giant kelp. And so let's talk a little bit about what comprises kelp itself, all the pieces of it. So, although it looks like a plant, it's actually a really large brown macroalgae. So, we have giant kelp on the right, and then we have bull kelp on the left. And so the predominant species we have off the Oregon coast is bull kelp. And so they only live about 18 months and they grow up to 100 feet, which is about 10 inches per day. And so, what makes up kelp itself? So, instead of having roots that suck up nutrients like a plant does, since it's an algae, it has something called a holdfast, which I like to think of it as like a hard, sticky spaghetti. So, once it finds a rocky, hard substrate when it's a baby kelp and latches onto there, then it grows a stipe because ultimately it wants to reach the tippy top of the surface of the water to get to that sunlight. And so it grows that big stipe and then it has to float to get to the top of the surface. So it has a gas-filled bulb called a pneumaticist. And then from there, it has 50 to 100 different blades to photosynthesize and thrive up there. And then on the opposing side, we have giant kelp. And so it also has a holdfast and a stipe. And instead of having one bulb, it has multiple bulbs with one blade coming off of each bulb. And so giant kelp is actually the fastest growing algae on the planet. It grows about 2 feet a day and can get up to 200 feet tall. Pretty amazing. So, why are underwater forests the best ecosystems ever? Let me tell you why. The kelp itself is what forms these three-dimensional underwater forests. So, hopefully, all of you have been on a hike before, especially here in Oregon on land, and we have some amazing forest ecosystems. Think of that same thing underwater. That's what a kelp forest is. It helps transport drifting eggs and larvae to support the next generation of marine life. It provides food and substrate for grazers, boosting biodiversity and overall ecosystem productivity. It breaks down into kelp detritus, which recycles nutrients throughout the food webs. It dampens wave energy and currents. So it helps protect our shorelines from erosion too, and it captures and stores carbon, which is a really important role when we're talking about climate change. So they're highly productive carbon sinks. There's a lot of research going into this right now. And these underwater forests support productive coastal food web systems, sustain prey, especially for gray whales, large megafauna off of the Oregon coast, particularly the Pacific Coast Feeding Group. And these gray whales in this group have shrunk, unfortunately, over 13% in the past 2 decades, with whales born in 2020 expected to be significantly smaller than those born before 2000. And so researchers think that potentially signaling climate-driven changes in the ocean ecosystems is the cause of that. So we'll talk a little bit about the kelp forest cover in a couple more slides. So for me, as a visual learner, I really like to look at the kelp carbon cycle in this fun little infographic. So kelp uses sunlight and carbon dioxide from the water during photosynthesis to grow, and this process helps remove CO2 from the atmosphere. And then as kelp grows big and strong, it stores carbon in its blades, stipes, and holdfasts. And then when animals eat the kelp, the carbon is stored and it moves up the food chain. And then when kelp dies, hopefully it floats out to the middle of the ocean and sinks down to the bottom of the seafloor and gets covered in sediment. And so that's how carbon is trapped with kelp. And so, thanks to Dr. Jim Estes' groundbreaking research, we know that sea otters are a keystone species. And so, a keystone species means that they have a really large impact on their ecosystem and environment relative to their abundance. So, just a handful of sea otters has a really big impact on the health of, say, a kelp forest or estuary. And I particularly really love these photos from Ralph Pace, who is an underwater photographer in Monterey Bay. And he was able, with a U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service permit, to photograph sea otters underwater because it is illegal to get this close to them. And also, it's super hard to photograph them underwater because they are so darn quick. And so I really love to show these because it's not something that we all get to see every day. And so here's another graphic that kind of displays the role of sea otters as a keystone species controlling the sea urchin population. So when sea otters are removed from the kelp forest ecosystem, then the sea urchins are like, hey, well, there's nothing here that I need to hide from anymore. I'm just going to come out and consume kelp at a really alarming rate. And so that is currently happening off of much of the Pacific coastline right now as we have an imbalance with missing predators that consume these purple urchins, and they are just having a heyday, which we can dive into a little bit more specifically in Oregon right now. So we've got two different types of urchins on the Oregon coast. We have red and purple. Red are larger. If you open your hand up, it's about the size of your hand, sort of like a basketball. And then purple urchins are quite smaller, so they're just about the size of your fist. And they eat kelp, algae, decomposing critters. Something really unique about red sea urchins is that a scientist found one that was 200 years old. And that's just the oldest one we found, so they may live longer than that, which is really incredible. And that's probably due because they never stop growing. They grow really slowly, only about a hundredth of an inch per year after they reach adulthood. And they're really sensitive beings. And what I mean by that is that they're sensitive to pollution. So they're a great water quality indicator. If there is pollution in the water, then the sea urchins will not be doing great. And then that can trigger scientists to take a look into what is going on in the ecosystem. So, while sea otters have been absent in Oregon for over 100 years, there's been another key predator in the kelp forests along much of the western Pacific, and that is the sunflower sea star, which is the largest sea star species on the planet. They have over 24 of those huge arms. Unfortunately, though, there was a marine heat wave, and scientists think this triggered something called sea star wasting disease. Um, and basically, that meant over 20 different species of sea stars were affected. Their limbs would break off from their bodies and just walk away from themselves, and they just turned into a gooey mush. And it took about 10 years, but finally, we have the answer of what caused sea star wasting disease, and it's a bacterium called Vibrio pectinacida. And so this bacteria has devastated coral and shellfish as well as humans. Specifically, it's the same pathogen that causes cholera. And so now that the pathogen behind sea star wasting disease has been identified, scientists are turning their attention to understanding the factors that drive disease outbreaks related to Vibrio and the resilience of marine species. So this is really important because there are multiple groups working to raise sunflower sea stars in labs to release them back into kelp forests. And so stay tuned. There's a lot of wonderful things happening with that right now. So here in Oregon, the Oregon Kelp Alliance recently released an Oregon Kelp Forest Status Report. And so basically, they summarized about 10 years of data of kelp forest cover on the Oregon coast. And unfortunately, it looks like we've lost about two-thirds of our kelp forest coverage over the last decade or so. Although we have some locations that have increased percentage of cover, and it could be attributed to multiple combination of factors, which include warming ocean temperatures, overgrazing of unchecked sea urchins, and the loss of key predators like sea otters and sunflower sea stars. So, visually speaking, you have a really healthy kelp forest that's in balance, and then you turn into an urchin barren. So, that's basically if you were to look down at the bottom of the ocean floor, you just see a carpet of purple sea urchins that are devouring kelp. And then they are pretty much the worst invertebrate to lack a predator because they just don't die. They turn into this zombie state. Zombie urchins are what we call them. So where kelp forests have declined so much, the sea urchins lack their primary food source, and then they stop reproducing because they don't have enough energy. They slow down their metabolism drastically, and they can go a whole year without ever eating anything. So it's really bad. And so in this photo here, the urchins on the left are zombie urchins. And then the ones on the right are very healthy sea urchins. So that yellow stuff is called uni. Those are gonads, they're reproductive organs. Also on sushi menus a lot of the time. So if you eaten uni before, you're eating the gonads of these purple urchins, which I say go for it because we need more people to eat sea urchins because they're overpopulating. I've never tried it, but I heard it was salty. Okay, so now let's switch gears and talk about the past, present, and future of sea otters here in Oregon and what the Elakha Alliance is all about. So, a super condensed timeline, several million years. So, about 2 million years ago, sea otters evolved near somewhere near modern day Russia, and their population went across the North Pacific and from Baja, California, all the way to Japan. And about 10,000 years ago, Native Americans arrived to the Pacific Northwest, and sea otters thrived along the coast along with these tribal people. And locations in Oregon today, like Otter Rock and Otter Point, are direct translations given to these places by indigenous tribes. And 115 years ago marked the end of the maritime fur trade, which began in the mid 1700s. We'll talk a little bit about that in a second, but unfortunately, that decimated about 99% of the global population of sea otters on the planet. And then about 55 years ago was the first translocation attempt of sea otters to the Oregon coast, which we will also talk about too. So I really want to highlight the indigenous importance, really strong cultural significance of sea otters in our coastal tribes. So we know there's at least 6 different words for sea otter alone in 8 different indigenous languages. If you look at the first one, the Chinook word for sea otter, look at that, Elakha. So that is where our name came from. And something really unique to the Oregon coast is that we have shell middens that have been identified along the coast of Oregon, which are basically like discard piles for indigenous peoples. And we found that both northern subspecies and southern subspecies of sea otters lived along the Oregon coast, which is really important because the genetic diversity of the southern sea otters is very low. So if we were to have an area where the northern and southern could intermingle once again, then that would be really crucial for the overall health of the species. So I mentioned the maritime fur trade. And so the Chinese really valued sea otter pelts. So they were very expensive. So Russian, Spanish, British, and US mariners all came to the Pacific Northwest to hunt sea otters for that precious fur. And unfortunately, indigenous people were enslaved by many of these mariners because they were really well equipped for hunting sea otters because they did it themselves with their tribes. So that happened in just about 200 years, they killed 99% of all sea otters on the planet. But thankfully, 1% did survive. And so there was about 11 remnant populations that did survive the fur trade. We have a tiny pocket off the coast of California, off of the coast of Big Sur. And there was about 50 or so that survived the fur trade there. And then there were several remnant populations across the Aleutian Islands. And you can see in black there on that map, that is their native range. So where they lived before the fur trade took them all out. So where are sea otters today and what are their populations? You're asking yourself. Well, that is what I'm here to tell you. So California has about 3,000 sea otters, and they have kind of plateaued on their population growth because they can't expand north or south due to various reasons like white shark predation. So they are 3,000 that came from the surviving 50 of the fur trade, which is why their genetic diversity is very low. In Washington, they were reintroduced in the 1970s, and now we have a stable population of around 3,000. British Columbia, there was also a reintroduction at the 1970s as well, and we've got about 8,000 there. Alaska also had a reintroduction in Southeast Alaska, but had several remnant populations. That's where 90% of the global population of sea otters live, is in Alaska. We have about 100,000 there now. Japan has a very small population of around 50, and Russia has about 18,000 sea otters there. So, in around 1969, 1972, researchers and scientists were working to try and save a population of sea otters that were off of Amchitka Island, where they were doing nuclear bomb testing by the US government. So they had to move really quickly and swiftly to capture as many sea otters as they could. And so they took them to Oregon, Washington, British Columbia, and Southeast Alaska in these translocation efforts. So nearly 100 animals were released at Cape Arago, and about the same or a little less than that in Port Orford. And so none of these sea otters were tagged, and they didn't start viewing the sea otters and observing them until a year after they did the translocation. So it appears some of the animals immediately left when they were translocated, which happens with any wildlife translocation. I mentioned sea otters have a really strong homing mechanism, so they probably tried to swim back home to Alaska. They could have maybe joined the Washington population, which was the closest to them, but we don't know because none of them were tagged. And so they did survive and have pups for about a decade, and then they all just eventually dwindled and ended up with zero on the Oregon coast. And so researchers think they just didn't release enough animals initially to withstand natural immigration and mortality rates that happen in a wildlife translocation. And so we now have over 50 years of data and research and understanding and many years of planning an actual translocation in the future that I think would be much more successful than this one. So let's talk about us, the Elakha Alliance. Who the heck are we? So we were an idea by the late David Hatch, who's photographed there on the left. He was a Siletz tribal member, and he was building a boat with his son Peter and came across the word Elakha in a Chinook trade jargon dictionary and was like, huh, that's a great name for a boat. And also, why don't we have sea otters on the Oregon coast? What happened to them? And so that led to several decades of questioning and getting people rallied behind him to lead a reintroduction effort to bring sea otters back for tribal cultural significance as a keystone species and to help with our marine ecosystems. Unfortunately, David passed away very unexpectedly in 2016, but that momentum and his passion to bring sea otters back lives on through the Elakha Alliance, which formed a board of directors, and we became an official nonprofit in 2020. And so I like to say we're small but mighty, making big waves for sea otter reintroduction. We have an incredible board of directors. You can go to our website to check them out, and they're fantastic backgrounds. And I will introduce all of our staff to you. It's just me here tonight, so sorry. But we have Jane Beccari, who's our executive director, myself, director of outreach and community relations. We have Kyle Motley, who is down in Coos Bay. He's our coastal community coordinator. Jane and I are both in Portland. And then we have Katie Russell, who is our development and operations coordinator down in Eugene. So we have 4 full-time staff and working hard for sea otter restoration on the coast. We also have four tribal members on our board of directors, I want to mention, from three different tribes. So our mission is to make Oregon's marine and coastal ecosystems and communities more robust and resilient by restoring a healthy population of sea otters to the Oregon coast. We just tweaked this last year to really put forth, first and foremost, the health of the overall marine ecosystem is really the key for sea otter restoration. Sea otters are cute. They're very fun megafauna to have off of the Oregon coast, but their real key goal is to be a keystone species and is the best long-term solution for the overall health of our kelp forests and estuary marine ecosystems. And obviously, bringing back a culturally significant species for our coastal tribes in Oregon is also very important to us. So we're really grounded on getting the science right. So we want to do as much research as possible for when a reintroduction is proposed, that we have everything we need to make it happen. So in 2022, we hired the top 6 sea otter scientists across the globe to figure out, is it even feasible to bring sea otters back to the Oregon coast, and would they survive? So we determined that yes, it is feasible. So sea otter reintroductions have been very successful in the past, and that it would likely succeed here on the Oregon coast, and that estuaries may be also a key place for reintroduction. And based on this feasibility study, Dr. Tim Tinker, who was the lead author, created an Oregon sea otter statistical model where you could go on and say, I want to put 50 male sea otters and 50 female sea otters off of Cape Arago, off of the Oregon coast, and then it would show you a statistical model of the likelihood success based on all of the data that he has on those locations. And so I'll come back to that in a second. But overall, big takeaway is that yes, it is feasible. You can also view every single chapter of this on our website for free, and you can download it as well. So you can go there by OregonSeaOtters.org and check that out. And then in 2022 as well, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service published their own feasibility assessment, and they concluded that reintroducing sea otters to Oregon is ecologically feasible and could have significant benefits for marine ecosystem health, which is a huge bonus. And U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, though, has not taken a position on whether to move forward or not, and we probably won't hear from them for the next several years. So, what are our next steps? So, as the director of outreach, obviously doing this and teaching all of you about the Elakha Alliance is my job and my passion. And so, thank you for being here tonight. So, raising awareness across the state and honestly across the United States and internationally about this topic is really important to us because having a healthy ocean ecosystem benefits our land. It produces oxygen. So, every time you take a breath, you're breathing in oxygen from the ocean. So we are all connected. Everything is interconnected. And we're also ramping up our political support. So I'll put a QR code up there. If you are in Oregon or you come here for tourism, I highly suggest you scan that. It'll take you to our action alert page on our website. And there is a bill right now, a 1.25% for wildlife that is really amazing if you fill that out and send a letter to your legislator. And then we're also doing a lot of tribal engagement, which I can touch upon in a second on something that we're working on for the next 3 years. And then we're filling in information and research gaps based on our feasibility study. And one of those things is working and hiring researchers to figure out where white sharks hang out on the Oregon coast. So we hired the OSU Big Fish Lab for that. We're doing shell fisheries assessment, and so on and so forth. So we were really focused on working with the federal government, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service over the last couple of years, but with this new administration, that's kind of taken a back seat. And so instead, we are really working with the tribes and a state-led effort to lead reintroduction here on the Oregon coast. And that mostly is due to this amazing news. The Confederated Tribes of Siletz Indians submitted a full proposal under the America the Beautiful Challenge grant in 2024. And thankfully, at the start of 2025, they got the good word that they did receive $1.56 million over 3 years to lead a planning process for reintroduction of sea otters to the Oregon and Northern California coastline. And so the Elakha Alliance is partners with this plan along with the Confederated Tribes of Coos, Lower Umpqua, and Siuslaw Indians, the Yurok Tribe, the Tolowa Dene Nation, and other regional partners and collaborators. So this finally, it took a year of paperwork, but the grant is funded and we are starting this year. We are hiring a reintroduction planning manager, which just concluded getting applications yesterday. So we'll have a new person on board for the next 3 years to help manage this grant. And in hopefully 3 years, we'll have a reintroduction proposal with the tribes. So this is really positive news for us moving forward. Another positive thing that happened in 2025 was a connection with the Wildlife Conservation Network, which is a really amazing group that connects very wealthy donors with wildlife conservation groups from across the globe. And so they launched the Sea Otter Fund specifically to raise $42 million in 12 years for sea otter restoration along their historical U.S. Pacific coastal range. And so it kicked off last year in April with Jane Goodall, rest in peace. And so she was a huge proponent to help sea otters and bring them back. So the number may seem a little confusing or random, but it's not. That is the estimated value that U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service proposed in their assessment that it would cost for a sea otter reintroduction over a 12, 13-year period of time. So, how can you help the Elakha Alliance? Firstly, you can sign up for our monthly newsletter. It just went out today if you're already signed up. It comes from me, a friendly face. So hopefully you can sign up and you can stay up to date with all our events and updates. Donations are also really wonderful. We have a great list of monthly donors, which ranges in values. Whatever you can do would be amazing. I also have a little fun kelp sea otter coloring page if you have kiddos in the house. And then you can also invite us to come speak. So you can invite me or my colleagues to come speak. We do virtual presentations like this one, or we can hopefully come into a classroom, or I'm going to present to a construction company in a couple of weeks. So it varies if you want to do lunch and learn. We'd love to help spread our message. All of this is available on our website too if you don't get to the QR codes fast enough. And we're across every social media platform. So if you need some fun sea otters or pretty kelp forest pictures in your news feed, be sure to give us a follow. And you'll also hopefully learn a couple fun things too about the ocean. And to get to our website, you can also get there easily by going to OregonSeaOtters.org because Elakha is maybe a confusing name to remember tomorrow. How to spell. Okay. We're an alliance, so we have some amazing partners that are helping us with this effort to restore sea otters along the Oregon coast. So I want to thank all of these wonderful groups, and there is definitely more than just these, but it takes a village, so to speak, to make big waves for our ecosystems. And so sometimes we do have uh, a rare number of sea otter sightings on the Oregon coast, and they have all been males. And so in 2024, there were two males spotted off of the coast of Ecola Point, which is near Cannon Beach. And so Brett Williard is an amazing resident there who filmed this and allows us to showcase it. But these are lone males coming down from the Washington population. It's estimated because they have the freedom to explore and look for other rafts of females to spread their seed. So unfortunately, Oregon doesn't have any female rafts, so they don't stick around for very long, or they wash up already deceased on our coastline. But this was a really beautiful thing to witness in person. I was able to go down there and see them for myself. And here's a photograph I snapped of one of them. That was on the cover of every Oregon newspaper as the huge news of sea otters off of the Oregon coast. And with that, that is all I have for you. So I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have after that presentation. And thanks for staying here with me. Thanks, Amy, for those kind words. Yeah, and we have so many more webinars on our YouTube channel if you really want to take a deep dive, and some amazing scientists and researchers have presented for us. Let's see. In 1982, it's recommended that translocations to one specific area would need 50 or 25 to 50 otters per year for the period of 3 to 5 years for establishment of a population. Are those still the target numbers? Oh, so what I didn't mention is that Dr. Tim Tinker has a second edition of the sea otter model that includes Northern California and Oregon with updated data. So that is being published in a paper right now. And so that will be the best way to sort of guess how many sea otters to put at a specific location along the Oregon and northern coastline. So it's estimated about 150 or so, depending on location, is kind of the key number to reintroduce in a specific area. Thanks for that question. And as I mentioned, our feasibility study and also US Fish's feasibility study are both available online if you really want to take a deep dive on reading a lot of the background history of reintroductions and the current status of our ecosystems. Great. Thanks, Melanie and Matt. Why are higher populations seen in British Columbia and Alaska? So, if you look at the map of British Columbia and Alaska, it's a super long linear coastline that is like the perfect habitat for sea otters to thrive. So that's why they are very plentiful in Alaska, and it's just the perfect place for them. And there's enough food and all the fun things. Vanessa, hi. You mentioned sometimes you get sea otters that wind up dead on the Oregon coastline. How common is that? Happens about 5 to 6 times a year. So a little less than 10. And oftentimes, if they're not fully decomposed, they can do a necropsy to figure out why they deceased. But they have all been males that have washed ashore. All right. Is there any opposition to relocating sea otters along the Oregon coast? There is not a group fully opposed to it, or a concentrated effort. We are working closely with the Dungeness Crab Commission and West Coast Seafood Processors Association to figure out what their concerns are and figure out if there are any concerns or negative impacts. How can we counteract that? So we are doing lots of research. The shell fisheries impact assessment is one to figure out if shell fisheries were impacted if they were returned to estuaries. So we're trying to do as much as we can to lessen any negative impacts that may occur on the Oregon coast. All right. I think that may be it if you don't have any more questions. Super. Okay. Well, thanks. Thanks, everyone. And hope you have a wonderful evening. Oh, let's see. If we find a deceased one, what should we do? You should contact US Fish and Wildlife Service. That would be great. Also, the Marine Mammal Stranding Network. Jim Rice is the one out of OSU who goes to do the necropsies. Also, the Oregon Coast Aquarium, too. But US Fish should be number one on that list. Okay. Thanks so much.